Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, friends, and perhaps foes. I am wonderfully humbled to be able to join these wonderful folks today in discussion with you. And I do want to emphasize that this is a true example of solidarity across communities. And I think we are hopefully providing an avenue where, as we navigate out of this pandemic world and resume the inequities that plague many of our communities, that we can come together with shared purpose to be able to combat the common enemy and not each other. And I hope that all of us in the audience embrace that challenge as we go along. My name is Arnab Mukherjea. I am an associate professor at California State University, East Bay. I am pleased to have the honor of moderating this session. My own work in the tobacco control field has largely been struggling around many of these issues, which is what is culture, what is culturally appropriate behavioral patterns, how does it relate, and how do we change those to advance health equity and reduce disparities, and then how do we combat the commercialization of harm and risk and profiting to cause death and disease among communities that are already disenfranchised or vulnerable. In the South Asian community, much of the tobacco use revolves around the use of smokeless products, combinations of betel nut and tobacco. They do have a cultural origin. They do have a cultural narrative that's associated with it. But what we're seeing more and more often in India and the broader South Asian subcontinent is the corporate interests that define how those things are manufactured, mass manufactured, sold very cheaply, avoiding issues of taxation, avoiding many of the things that effective tobacco control policy has begun to do in reducing at least the prevalence of cigarettes and other forms of smoked products in the community. So with that, I'm so happy to bring my African-American brothers and sisters and my Middle Eastern brothers and sisters together, because the common enemy is not a hookah or a menthol cigarette. The common enemy is the industry. And we have to remember that. And let's come together to do that. So with that, I am going to go ahead and start the conversation with some questions. And thank you for those of you that have submitted questions prior to the event and also that are coming in right now. So I get to play the DJ in an academic sense. And the first question I'll ask, since we just ended with a wonderful montage on the narrative, if you will, is Dr. Delaimy, I'm sorry. Can you tell us a little bit about the risk profile, what we know about morbidity and mortality regarding hookah use in the Middle East, as far as we know, and the attributable risk to hookah smoking?
Yes, thank you, Arnab. So the data on hookah use in the Middle East is not overwhelming, and there isn't a lot of research because research requires funding, and funding for research is very limited in these regions. So the data is mostly descriptive, and to really demonstrate the impacts in that region, we need to have people who have been smoking it and following them up over a period of several years to see the outcome. But we do have studies from the US and from Europe about hookah use impacts, as well as from laboratory analysis and studies mentioned by Dr. Gardner, that shows that the impacts are similar and the associations are similar. And why wouldn't it be similar? Because it's tobacco. Both of them are tobacco and both of them are burned. And we do know that the long-term impacts, the longer people use it, the more regular. So there's duration and intensity. So all of these can cause the same risk for heart disease, cancers, and so on. The other thing to know of is that somebody might say, I am just using hookah on weekends. Well, it's just like somebody saying, I occasionally smoke. Unfortunately, based on very rigorous and well-established studies, it sometimes takes several sessions, not always smoking, but even occasional smoking can trigger the carcinogenic process of lung cancer and other cancers. So these carcinogens are going to start and trigger and then produce these impacts. In addition, as I mentioned, the problem with hookah is that the amount of smoke that is smoked is much more than a cigarette. And with it is carbon monoxide from the coal. And so there are definitely some higher risks, but we don't have quantification from the Middle East.
Thank you, Wael. Dr. Millner, if I may, moving to sort of the role of industry and community organizations that claim to represent our communities. A question came in earlier. Why is it that the largest, our largest organizations, and I'm assuming this is reflective of the African-American community, why is it that our largest organizations are complicit in harming African-Americans? For example, Noble. And so if you could talk more about community-based organizations and what their role is, either for or against sort of health equity in our populations.
Well, community organizations are not beyond criticism, and that includes self-criticism. Whether it's the NAACP, which I've been a member of since I was 15 years old, or Black churches, or Black fraternities, and political organizations. I belong to a Black fraternity, but we have been very self-critical, and we've stopped some of the cultural practices that we, once engaged in. I'm what is called an Omega, and we used to have these kinds of activities that we called smokers, and it entailed just that, welcoming in people who were going to be considering joining the organization, and we would have a social activity that involved all kinds of behaviors, including what goes on in a smoker. And those things, are things that we as a community and we as a nation need to be very self-critical about. Black musicians have often found themselves pushed into workplaces that are just habitually dangerous. Secondhand smoke in bars in the 40s and 50s and 60s turned out to be devastating for some of the most important musicians that this society's ever created. They lost a lot of their artistic years through premature death. And just as sure as we are spending a Friday afternoon thinking about these serious issues, there are folks who are going to become deeply exposed and prematurely addicted to tobacco through both hookah and cheap menthol cigarettes. And some people are simply bought off. The Black community is very diverse. We are more than 40 million in our numbers. And that means there are all kinds of different, African Americans with different opinions. And some will take what I would, attribute it as something that might be close to a bribe, political contributions, all kinds of things that will move policy in ways that are not always positive. So in that respect, everything has changed, but nothing has changed.
We also have a contribution from Carol Magruder.
Yes, I wanted to add in, we have seen great change, thank God. And from when Dr. Valerie Yerger wrote her seminal paper, Smoking with the Enemy, that really documented how the tobacco industry just went after our African-American organizations and leadership groups perniciously. And all the groups used to take money, and that has changed. And most notably, Delta Sigma Theta sorority, our wonderful sistership organization of professional African-American women in this country, was one of the first organization on that stature to take a stand and ask the FDA to take menthol off the market. And since that time, they have had other resolutions about local work that the local branches and chapters can do. And then the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had a national resolution passed in 2016 after the deltas, and they have steadfast. They refuse to accept money from Jewel. And so you'll see different variances because, there's the national level, the state level, as you know, I'm a member as well. And so, but nationally, National is holding firm and is very involved in all of our efforts across the country to get Newports and flavored tobacco out of the Black community. And so we see the industry stepping up their cultivation of other groups, but there are some major significant groups, including the National Medical Association that joined our lawsuit. So we're seeing a shift, and we need the shift to keep shifting in the way of the people.
Thank you, Carol. I appreciate you showing that our organizations are indeed evolving to a lens of equity. Dr. Al-Delaimy, I know you referred to this in your presentation, but just to be clear for the audience members, is there any religious or cultural significance to unflavored hookah from a historical or even current perspective in your personal experience and your scholarly activities?
The short answer is no. As a matter of fact, as the majority of that region are Muslim, or more than 92 or 95%, Islam prohibits any self-harm. So once it was evident in the 50s and 60s, or actually in the 60s, that tobacco use is harmful and can cause death, it became forbidden. Tobacco use is forbidden for Muslims to use. That includes hookah, that includes cigarettes, that includes anything that is tobacco. However, when I raise this issue with people, and I can tell you almost all very well practicing Muslims do not smoke in any kind of form. But when I raise it with others, they say, well, it is maybe not forbidden. Maybe it's discouraged, because they based it on earlier Muslims before they knew that hookah was harmful or cigarettes was harmful, and they didn't make it forbidden. But once the evidence was there, it was forbidden. So there's no religious in any way connection. In terms of the culture, as I mentioned, I grew up in that region, and there were some elderly who used it, just like some elderly, like my grandfather used to roll their own, before the manufacture of cigarettes were happening, and he was used to that. So that doesn't give it any cultural aspect. And people look down at, hookahs for older folks who, pre-cigarette manufacturing. So the question is, if it was cultural, again, why did it appear again? If it wasn't cultural, why did it appear again? It appeared because of the adding of the flavors in the last decades, where it became more interesting, smelling nice, and the young folks got interest, and then there was a business out of that. So it has nothing to do with the tradition or the culture.
And if I can continue on this thread, are you aware either internationally, in my own work, I see a lot of the manufacturers of snus are now targeting the Indian smokeless tobacco, the indigenous products, if you will. Are you aware either internationally or domestically? For instance, Farah in the audience says the CEO of Al-Fakr is also from British American Tobacco. Are you aware of corporate interests that are pushing hookah commercialization?
The big industry are not going to invest until they see there's a good profit in business, right? So look at the e-cigarettes. It was invented by somebody in China, and then small companies. And then when it became popular, big industry came in and bought in, percentages of Juul or others. Same thing with hookah. Once there's a profit in the business, which is now hookah's becoming, then they jump in and have their hands on it. So I'm pretty sure that industry has something to do with this, as well as now it has its own industry of the hookah commerce chamber or something like that. They're all faces for the same industry.
Thank you, Wael. Dr. Millner, and I'm going to feign ignorance on this, but you are the historian, so I was the student. Jose asks, Can anyone discuss the marketing strategies that Edward Bernays, 1929, Torches of Freedom used, and how that's still being used to influence people of color and poor folks, and how this form of marketing has now flourished?
Well, I would just say that the video that we watched about a half hour ago gave very vivid examples of the history of advertising in the Black community and in the national community. I'm not familiar with that particular incident, but I'm not going to be surprised by anything. The misuse of our athletic heroes, the cultivation of our political heroes and sheroes, those are all things that are both historic and contemporary. And we need to be open and honest about that. When you see baseball players in the 1940s and 50s, the first generation that was allowed to play white Major League Baseball, they almost immediately got co-opted and offered cheap salaries for advertising cigarettes. So those things never surprise me. It's important to note that big events always have an impact on tobacco use. World War I, soldiers from around the globe got access to cheap tobacco and they came back transformed. That was in cigarettes. Cigarettes have their own history. That's the cheapest tobacco that came out of the unused cigar tobacco. Snuff, all that stuff has been pushed on our communities over generations of time. So none of that surprises me, and it's going to be a real battle going forward with zoning regulations and things like that. When I first arrived in California, I arrived in a place called South Central Los Angeles. South Central Los Angeles, when I got there in the early 60s, had more than 712 liquor store outlets within a 60-block radius. And all those liquor stores were also tobacco shops. And that's always been the case. And Muslims always impressed me because they talked about no use of alcohol or tobacco. And I watched their discipline, and that was very impressive.
Thank you. This is a question for both of you. We're talking a lot about our role and responsibilities within the community setting, but also public policy plays a role. Public policy is very important for public health, as we are learning right now. So the question that has been asked is, do you think that taxing hookah, vapes, other forms of tobacco or flavoring, is that an appropriate policy level intervention, or does it wind up being regressive to the exact communities based on social and economic disadvantage? I will let whoever wants to take that first.
Any tactic that brings a halt or diminishes the use of either tobacco or hookah, as far as I'm concerned, should be considered. I used to use the analogy that the city of Oakland, and I was very familiar with it, having spent 10 years at Berkeley, the west side and the east side, deep West Oakland and East Oakland, in the 1980s, there used to be a monthly drain of almost $30 million a month for cannabis use. And I didn't have the numbers for tobacco use, but it was similar. And it's all a drain from people who, if you say that Black Lives Matter, then you've got to stand against this nonsense, because addictions also matter to those who are poorest. And my father always found enough money for his cigarettes, but he didn't always find enough money for me to get 2 hot dogs on Friday. I usually had to get only 1, but there was always that money for cigarette use. And I'm sure that there are people who are going to, be crippled economically from addictions to these modern tobacco products. So anything that can stop it, I say, needs to be at least considered.
Dr. Al-Delaimy, did you have a thought on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's well-proven policies of tobacco control that, a single policy by itself doesn't work. So if you have increased taxes, you also have to have banning of flavoring so it doesn't target the young. There is education and addiction treatment. So it has to all come one in hand, but definitely making it cheaper doesn't help. And not having a tax doesn't help because it makes it easier for people. So I think I would support any decision, as Dr. Millner said.
Thank you for that. This question came up prior to our session. It is brought up in the chat room. I think it's important. How can someone appropriately message this? And I will broaden that to advocate out, and serve as an ally, if they're not from the community not from the community that is being targeted. And to follow up on that, how can they help in the cause without invoking white saviorism? So a very complicated one. Dr. Al-Delaimy, I'll start with you on this one. And then Dr. Millner, please do respond.
Yes, again, I think it's like we do research with communities of different culture. You need to have first an understanding of that culture. And second, you need to have allies from that culture so that you don't kind of speak on behalf of that culture, whether it's Arab, whether it's Black, whether it's Latino, whatever it is. You need to have that collaboration. And that's why I kind of really was enthusiastically supportive of this kind of event, because as far as I know, for the first time, bringing these two cultures together to address a common problem. I kind of, something that is relevant that happened many, many years ago, but I think it's relevant here. And in the US, there's always a discrimination and targeting by one community versus another. But the problem is other communities don't support the community that is targeted. And that is unfortunately part of this culture. In 1953, remember, 1953, a young Arab student came to study in North Carolina. And he befriended another fellow Arab who's African. Arabs have dark skin, like Sudan and others light skin. So that young person was light skin and his friend was dark skin. And so they went into the bus, and he saw that the bus, if people are fair skinned, they are in the front, and those who are dark skinned in the back. So he's not going to leave his friend sitting there. So he went in solidarity and sat with him in the back. But the bus driver stopped the bus and said, "Hey, you," to him, to the fair skin, "you're in the front." And then he refused to do that. So the bus didn't want to move until that person moved. And so there was an argument in, of course, broken English for that person coming. And they both, in defiance, stepped out of the bus. No one in the bus supported them. They had to have a long walk home because they couldn't afford a taxi. But the idea here is we have to, that person was my father. And he told us this story, how the segregation and how the discrimination based on color was foreign. And so we have to come and work together, whether it is discrimination, whether it is tobacco, whether it is anything, and come together, those who are targeted communities. And that's why I feel like this is where it's helpful to talk across cultures and like this event.
Dr. Millner?
When it comes to strategies or allies to combat this false use of flavors. We need all the allies across ethnic lines and across gender lines and across all lines that we can get. Because this really is a fight for people's economic future, their health future, and we're just starting this battle, and it's going to go on for some time. So no one should feel that they are foreign to this struggle. We welcome all, at least I can say that from my point of view.
I think that will be a nice note of solidarity to end this panel, this conversation. I'm going to turn it over to Nicole to take it from here, but I thank both of our esteemed guests for really giving a snapshot of what we can really do together and the power of solidarity. And I hope for the audience that this provides a pathway for us to do that in concert with each other and for social equity. Thank you.